The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for NCEA's webinar, Diving in Disciplinary Literacy, Keys to Deeper Learning Within All Subjects, offered in partnership with Discovery Education. I'm Andrea Cobb, Manager of Educational Resources for NCEA, and I'm happy to host this webinar for you today. Before we begin, please know that all your microphone connections have been muted. If you have questions or comments during today's presentation, please send those through the question box that appears in your GoToWebinar panel. To ask a question or use a comment, you use your mouse to click into the blank box area, type your question using your keyboard, and then click send. Our presentation today will last about an hour. It will be interactive, so we invite you to post your comments and questions throughout the webinar. Immediately following the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief survey about your experience, and I thank you in advance for providing us with this valuable feedback. You will receive an email tomorrow with instructions on accessing this webinar recording, all the presentation materials, and your certificate of attendance. You can also download handouts now from the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel to refer to during the presentation. Let us begin as we do all things in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Frank Florence, National Director for Partner Support, and Johnna Weller, Director of Professional Learning with Discovery Education. Welcome, Frank and Johnna. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrea. It's great to be here, and we really appreciate the chance to meet with our Catholic education customers through NCEA and discuss this topic today. I think you'll find that we have a great webinar established for you. We have a couple of chat exercises and poll exercises in the webinar that we'll be going through, and don't forget the handouts are on the right side of your screen to access if you'd like to. So welcome to the registrar. Welcome to the webinar. John, you want to advance the slide? Okay, so for those of you on the webinar who are familiar with Discovery, we actually have a newly established relationship with NCEA. We're an NCEA strategic partner, and very happy to be that. We support over 2,500 Catholic schools now across the country, and one of the reasons the Catholic schools really appreciate the Discovery approach in digital content and PD support is our instructional rigor, our transdisciplinary focus, and the integrated learning model that we have across all of our subject areas. We also partner very closely with the Catholic schools, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. We're now the #1 digital content provider in the country, offering textbooks, PD, and STEM, and our textbooks now support more than 3 million students across the country. We also have a newest textbook availability for science and NGSS, which a lot of our Catholic schools are looking at or using across the country, and very happy to support them on that. Okay, John, next slide. One of the reasons the Catholic schools really appreciate the chance to work with Discovery Education is the way we approach a partnership. As Catholic schools begin the process of looking at going digital, it can be a very daunting exercise and a very imposing project, and Discovery makes it easier for our school customers by adopting a very strong partner orientation to everything we do. We also have a very broad scope of content and work that we provide our Catholic school customers, all the way from instructional content through community, our research and evaluation and engagement programs for a wide array of things that Catholic schools can take and access as well. Next slide, Johnna. And if you look at Discovery Education's focus across the country, as I said, we support more than 3 million educators and 30 million students. We have deep support in our content and textbook. Johnna, you may want to advance here and do a build. On the right side, lower right side of the slide, you can see a screenshot of our math textbook, which is supporting hundreds of thousands of students now. On the left side, example of some of our PD offerings, and there's a catalog link for PD that we can give you later if you're interested in that. And then the last slide, Johnna, for me. Okay, just a brief snapshot or a glimpse of what we have upcoming in the way of NCEA DE events. So at the end of March, we're doing our 3rd webinar with NCEA, this one on finding and growing teacher leaders. Carol Wetzel and Andrew will be hosting that for us Tuesday, March 28th. And then if you or some of your colleagues are visiting the NCEA 2017 conference in St. Louis, Discovery is working with a number of different dioceses and archdioceses across the country on developing 3 workshops: developing literacy through inquiry, leading and learning in a digital world, and decreasing the achievement gap with STEM. In fact, Cindy Moss, our national STEM leader, will be presenting along with Johnna at that workshop on Thursday, April 20th. So if you're going to St. Louis, we would encourage you to sign up for these workshops and seminars and look forward to hosting you there. Okay, Johnna, next slide, and I'm very pleased to introduce Johnna Weller, who will take us through the topic today, diving into disciplinary literacy. Johnna is Director of Professional Development at Discovery Education, has a broad background which she'll share with you in a minute. We're very pleased to have her speak to our guest today. So Johnna, take it away.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Andrea, and welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to be on this webinar with all of you. So today we're going to talk about disciplinary literacy. We're going to dive into that topic, and just this initial slide, I'm coming to you from the state of Florida, where sea turtles are very important to us here. So I just wanted to point out that if you know anything about sea turtles, you know that they go from a very, very small size to a very large size throughout their lifetime. So whatever your experience and background is with this topic of disciplinary literacy, whether it's new to you or whether you've been swimming in these waters for quite some time, we hope that our conversation today will help you navigate these waters and learn and grow and get some strategies to help you take back to the students in your classroom and your school. So this is me. Pleased to meet you. I'm Director of Professional Learning, like Frank said, at Discovery Education. I have been a lifelong learner and lover of literacy, and because I'm a mom, my children are too, whether they like to admit that or not sometimes, but that's very near and dear to our hearts. I've had many years, over 20 years of experience as a classroom teacher, a special education teacher, a reading specialist, and most recently working as school central office administrator and assistant superintendent in several different school districts. And I've been with Discovery Education now for 4 years in my role as Director of Professional Learning, where I have the wonderful privilege of working with teachers and administrators, educators all around the country to promote and help them develop this idea of literacy and certainly in technology integration and transforming learning. And my background as an educator myself has been as a learner myself. I've been Catholic education myself since I started kindergarten, in fact, all the way up through my doctoral program. So you all are very near and dear to my heart as well. So here's the way we'll talk through this topic today of disciplinary literacy, and there are 3 keys that we're going to touch upon, and it is what is it and what isn't disciplinary literacy, why it matters, and then how to maximize it for your students. So we want to really dig into this topic a little bit today. So I'm going to ask you, first and foremost, because obviously students come first, we want to put students in the forefront, and I'd like you to think of a student that you have right now in your classroom or in your school. Whatever grade level you teach, whether you're an administrator in a district, just think of a particular student in your classroom or school or district. And I'd like you to think about that student, and then let's talk a little bit about what skills he or she will need to be ready for an unpredictable future. So wherever that student is today, we're not obviously sure what that future is going to look like for that student as that student walks across the stage or takes their diploma when they leave us. So what kind of skills will that student need to be successful in their future? So I'm going to ask you all to put your comments in the chat box, and we'll try to generate a list here. We'll brainstorm a list together of those skills that will help them to be successful in that future. So we'll keep our eyes here on the chat box as you all are putting some comments in there. Everybody able to access that chat box?
Johnna, we have some comments coming in. I see math, literacy,
Right.
critical thinking, reading skills, communication skills, lots of things regarding communication, literacy, and math.
Oh, great, great. Thank you, Andrea. So when we think about what those skills are, no matter what role our students take on in the future, regardless of whether they enter college or whether they get a career path or a technical area, we know we want to equip them with whatever they need to be successful adults. So certainly those skills like critical thinking, problem solving, adaptability, and communication are so important. And we know that so many of those skills are really practiced through the topic of literacy. So as we think about literacy in today's world, let's think through what literacy is. And certainly the term literacy has taken on a more sophisticated and multifaceted meaning in our world today. So literacy has been defined in many ways and continues to evolve, but the consistent theme is the effective use of language: reading, writing, speaking, listening, and thinking. So we often define literacy as the ability to make and communicate meaning, and our friends Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry define it as acquiring and communicating information in ways that demonstrate an understanding of the context through analyzing and interrogating. So we often think of a literate person, and we think of illiteracy as being something that means that you can't read or write. Certainly, literacy has different levels and different degrees of literacy. So, for example, literacy has expanded to include literacy in information, so information literacy, communication technologies, and critical literacy. So if we think of literacy as only consuming information, we run the risk of making our students vulnerable to misinformation, particularly in today's world. So as we think about that broad topic of literacy, what about disciplinary literacy? And that's a relatively new phrase on the scene of education in the last several years. And we hear that, and there are a lot of different interpretations of that. So let's kind of clear up what it is and what it isn't. So when we think of literacy in the subjects that we teach, regardless of whether that be English and reading, or math and science and social studies and business education and arts, we think of those in the content that is in our curriculum. And we need to consider this. What do we want our students to be able to do with the information and content that we teach? So, for example, is our learning goals to understand concepts? We want them to appreciate ideas versus memorizing. We want them to really dig into that idea of what is the content that they're learning. And that's really where this theme of disciplinary literacy comes in, because what we know is that experts read their respective texts quite differently. So as a scientist, the thinking and communication skills are different than they might be as for a historian, or for a mathematician, or for a musician, or an artist. So disciplinary literacy represents a significant transition from just the more generalized reading practices to a highly contextualized reading demand, such as reading, writing, and thinking through different lenses. Students are called upon, certainly in the elementary grades, and most definitely during middle and high school, to delve into increasingly complex texts that reflect the knowledge, processes, and wisdom, the discourses, of a host of academic disciplines. So as teachers, we need to show, demonstrate, and make visible to students how literacy operates within each academic discipline. Let's explore that idea a little bit further with this statement. And this is really a summary of disciplinary literacy and how it takes the general literacy skills, reading, writing, speaking, listening, and thinking, and almost wraps it in a ribbon around the discipline and the content that is being taught in any one subject area. So in the spirit of critical thinking, and of course the Discovery Channel's popular show Mythbusters, let's take a look at some ideas about disciplinary literacy and talk about their validity. So I'm going to ask you to identify whether these ideas are confirmed or if they're merely myths. So I'll show you a statement, and then I'm going to ask you, Andrea is going to be kind enough to open a poll for us. So I would like you to decide whether this statement is myth or whether it's confirmed. So here is, oops, no, I think I need to click on the next slide. There we go. So this statement, confirmed versus myth. Disciplinary literacy is the same as content literacy. So what do you think about that? Let's see what kind of results we get. Ooh.
Where your results say 80% say myth, 20% say confirmed.
Okay, well, then it looks like majority rules in this particular instance because that is a myth. Disciplinary literacy and content literacy are not the same. And here's how they're a little bit different. It's important to acknowledge that those norms and conventions of each discipline are specific. So for example, the kind of evidence used in history and science is different than the kind of evidence that students are seeking in math. So when we think of those general, broad content literacy, and if you've been teaching for a while, if you've been in education, you might be familiar with the term reading and writing across the curriculum. And certainly, those are skills that we want to continue to promote, but we can't forsake the fact that reading and writing in each discipline is a little bit different. And if we're really equipping our students to be experts in their fields and to master the skills that they need, the things that you talked about earlier, critical thinking and literacy, that we need to be more refined in the way we develop those skills. So things such as attention to precise details, the capacity to evaluate intricate arguments, synthesizing complex information, following detailed descriptions, has a little bit of a different flavor in every subject area. So here's a nice comparison. This comes from some work by Fagella, Luby, and Desher, and Shanahan, who make a side-by-side comparison here of content literacy, which are very general, generic literacy skills, and they're very generalizable to other domains. So things such as making connections, asking questions, summarizing. They're very broad and general, and certainly they're important. So please don't think that content literacy is not important. But disciplinary literacy, in the chart on the left, you see in that column there on the left, really is about the specialized strategies, routines, and skills within the content areas. And that obviously makes it a little bit more rigorous for our students and a little bit more focused specifically on the content that they're learning. So you might all be familiar with things such as these, the generic reading strategies, which again are very important, and we certainly don't want to discount the importance of them as readers. And certainly we all, as readers ourselves, apply these types of things when we read everything from the newspaper to the TV guide to People magazine or whatever it might be that you read for pleasure, all the way up to when we read technical texts or textbooks, or if you're taking graduate courses or a student yourself, you understand that there are some specific things that raise the rigor into the content that you've been studying. So as we think about those disciplines and compare that to these generic reading strategies, if you think about what would it look like if we shifted this also toward disciplinary literacy. So think about the disciplines that you teach, and it may be more than one, certainly, particularly if you're at the elementary grade, and the teachers that you support in your schools as well, and the subjects that the content and curriculum and subjects that's being taught. So whether it be math or science or social studies or arts or media literacy, any of those things, think about the specific vocabulary that is specific to that discipline, the text types that are specific to that discipline. For example, in social studies, we might have students learning to evaluate maps and charts and tables differently than they would perhaps in math class, and even more differently than they might in science class. And we're going to do a little comparison of those in a few minutes. So certainly this happens and this continues throughout within their school career and beyond, through high school and beyond. So I'm going to take a few seconds, a little bit of a pause, to give you an opportunity to think through this and reflect on what might you put on that table on the right-hand side for disciplinary specific reading strategies that occur in your classroom based on the topic and content that you teach. So as you think through that, and certainly within the scope of our webinar right now, our time is not necessarily allowing us to take a lot of time to dig into that specifically for each of you individually, but would love to hear you think through that a little bit. I want to give you an opportunity to think about it for a few seconds, and then I'm going to share with you some resources where you can find them in our handout documents, actually, where you can find handouts, a handout that specifically gives you some ideas of what is it that students are making sense of in each subject and how do they do that. So in the handout section of your control panel, you'll see a handout called Literacy by Disciplines. And in that document, and it is not comprehensive, it is not every single aspect of literacy in a discipline. Certainly it's much more simplistic than that, but we wanted to provide you with at least a basic framework, a baseline of just how to get started in thinking about this. So for those of you that might be science teachers, you need to think about how do your students make sense of the resources and the ways that they're consuming information in science through what types of skills. In mathematics, same idea. So for example, you see on my screen right now, we have students making sense of word problems, equations, symbolic expressions, and so forth through these skills, these critical thinking literacy skills, inductive and deductive reasoning, spatial and algebraic reasoning, speculation and prediction, which, as you can tell, have very much of a math flavor to them. Not that they're not generalizable in other subject areas, but they're very specific to math. So as we think about how we can support our students in developing these skills, each one of us, through the discipline that we teach, is really honing in on preparing our students with a lot of these skills that some of you actually identified earlier when you were thinking about skills that they need for the future. So as you're looking through that handout, please feel free, download that, save that handout. It will definitely provide you with some resources and ways to help you maybe perhaps be more reflective and think about the ways that you're having your students engage in some of these topics and some of the processes in which the way they're thinking through the content that you're teaching. So at this point, I'm wondering if we can maybe, Andrea, can we just maybe ask if anyone has any immediate questions just specific to this before we move on.
We don't have
any questions. You can put them in the chat box. Anything in the chat box for questions?
We don't have any questions in the chat box at the moment, so I'll continue to curate those as they come in, and we'll do them at the end.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So again, some of you might find that handout that there might be more topics, more headers in that handout that apply to you depending on the topics that you teach. And those of you that are supporting teachers in the classroom, either through coaching or professional development or as administrators, certainly, as you're having those conversations with teachers and helping them to create spaces where students are becoming much more critical thinkers within the disciplines, this might be a handy resource for you. So that gives you a little framing of what disciplinary literacy is and certainly what it isn't. And most of you busted that myth pretty well, just like those Mythbusters do. So now let's take a look at why it matters. So remember that student that you identified earlier a few minutes ago and the skills that he or she will need for their future? That hinges upon their learning right now. And we certainly know that it's so important to teach students the difference between information and knowledge. Because for information to become knowledge, students must really think about it. And that's a cognitive skill that is certainly something that we want to promote in our classrooms. And not only does it help to develop their critical thinking skills, but it also helps to develop their problem-solving skills and gives them those opportunities to not just know something, but really to truly understand something and to go to those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So as we think about this idea of why it matters for our students, we really want to think about this, that content knowledge is strengthened when educators integrate this literacy into teaching and learning. Because it's not just helping them to be better thinkers, better readers, better writers, and better communicators, but it's also helping them to have a much deeper understanding of the topics that we're teaching. And isn't that really the goal of our curriculum anyway? It's really that we want our students to walk away with something so that years from now, when they think back to that particular chapter or that particular topic, that they have some understanding of it, some conceptual understanding, and certainly an appreciation for the things that you taught them. So I speak for myself here. I don't know if I can speak for all of you, but in many instances, if I had to go back to high school and take some of the tests that I took when I was there at the time and maybe pass that economics test again, it might be a little challenging today because I haven't really been applying some of those skills, but ideally, I should have been able to walk away from that classroom with a basic understanding and be able to think in those ways and then ideally apply them throughout my life as an adult. So certainly, and I don't need to read this to you because you all can read, but this is actually a message that's endorsed by many states and across state standards as well. But this one in particular, I love the language that they use here from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. And they talk about the way in which we as educators can help students recognize and understand the nuances of a discipline by using strategies that make our thinking visible. So as a teacher, and certainly an expert in the field in which you teach, the content that you know, you can certainly model your thinking for students. So you can do a lot of think alouds. You can problem solve out loud for them so that they see you interacting with that content and making sense of it yourself. And then as well as to promote those classroom reading, writing, listening, and speaking, and critical thinking using authentic materials. So that's another key piece to content and disciplinary literacy, is really selecting those content-specific and authentic materials. And that handout that I shared with you a little earlier, the left-hand column, talks about a lot of the different ways and resources that we process and that our students process in each discipline. So whether it be maps or charts or tables or articles or media or news or essays, whatever it might be, that are current events, for example, in social studies, that our students are really encountering. And truly, more than ever in history, we have access to so much more information. So our students do as well. And we can certainly have information at our fingertips. But really, the most important thing and the meaningful thing about that is how do we purposefully interact with it? Because there's no lack of information today, and there's no lack of being able to find it really quickly, actually, at your fingertips if you wanted it. But what's the thinking and the cognition that we're using to process that information to help us to be ready for that unpredictable future, to help us in our day-to-day roles, to help us make good decisions, to help us be better citizens, and to help us really be able to function well and ideally make the world a better place. So these literacy practices in classrooms really deepen students' content knowledge, strategies, and skills so that their learning transfers to those real-world situations. Because we know that's the real key important part, is transferring that to real-world situations beyond and outside of our classroom. So when we think about that visual online world that we have today and the way in which we glean so much information, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of thinking around this statement. Now this statement has 5 words missing, and I'm going to chunk it for you, so we'll talk through each one a little bit. But this is called a cloze activity, C-L-O-Z-E, and it's a way to encourage critical thinking. So I'm going to ask you to think about what words do you think would make sense in the blanks, and we'll look at the first 2 to start. So the statement says, in an increasingly visual and online world, students need to be able to blank and blank text that combine, and we'll continue that later, but what do students need to be able to do in our world today with text? You need to be able to blank and blank text. So what verbs, that was a big clue there, what verbs might make sense? So in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind posting your ideas and your hypotheses perhaps as to what you think would make sense in that sentence. So they need to be able to make sense of text. They need to be able to blank and blank text that combine blank, blank, and blank in order to make meaning of information that no longer reads in one clear linear direction. So we know that we have a lot of information coming to us. We know that students are finding information on websites. So what do they need to do with those texts? So they need to be able to blank and blank. What would you think would fit into those blanks? And I'll give you a few seconds to populate the chat box.
Johnna, we have some answers coming in already. Looks like read and comprehend, read and decipher, read and analyze, decode and analyze, comprehend and interpret, read and understand. That's just a sampling.
Okay, great, thank you. So a lot of you talked about the idea of reading, and certainly reading is a very key important skill, and we definitely know that we want all of our students to be certainly deep readers and thinkers. This statement actually talks about the idea of interpreting and creating text, which are obviously much higher level than merely reading. Certainly reading can take on a variety of different forms, and we do definitely want that piece for sure, but interpreting and creating. So think about your students as consumers So they're interpreting that information, they're interpreting those texts, and they're also creating text. So in today's world, we have our students not just as consumers of information, but also as producers of information. And many of you, as well as myself included, we're creating information all the time. I don't know about you, but if you're posting or if you're tweeting or if you are on Facebook or Instagram or even blogging or whatever it might be, whatever communication method, whether it be digital or not, we're all creators of text as well. So that's another way to think about the disciplinary literacy angle, is the way in which our students are interpreting information, but also the way in which they're creating that information. And certainly as they're doing that, these texts that they're interpreting and creating combine blank, blank, and blank in order to make meaning of information. So now think about the text that you interpret and create on a regular basis, or that your students might be interpreting and creating. What types of things are in those texts that help us make meaning? Because certainly those texts are multimodal. Those texts have a variety of different media involved in them. So what do you think might fit into those blanks? And please answer that in the chat box.
We have a couple answers coming in. Pictures, words, and context, knowledge, insight, and application.
Oh, interesting. Okay, great. So this particular statement, and again, your responses are equally as valid. This particular one talks about the idea of words, images, and sound. So when we think of multimodal text, and when you think of the resources that you are interacting with and your students are interacting with, certainly there are multiple opportunities for them to be interpreting and creating words and images and sound within a text. So it's great opportunities for us to think about at this point within the discipline that you teach. Where do your students have those opportunities to interpret not just words, not just text on paper, but images? Maybe it's a landscape, or maybe it's a geography, a picture of geography. Maybe it's a map. Maybe it's a globe. Maybe it's a historical picture. And how about sound? How about the idea of interpreting sound? How about music, or a speech given orally, or a sound bite, or a news clipping from the radio, or something like that, that would give students our opportunity to really interpret those, but then also to create them as well. Because certainly, and as this statement ends with here, that our information no longer reads in one clear linear direction. And if you have been on the websites, or if you've been on the internet at any point in time, you know certainly that there are lots of opportunities for hyperlinked text that lead us to images and slideshows. And we can listen to audio. A lot of times, even on the news sites, we go to, to read the news, or we go to a different website to learn something. And rather than just text, we see a lot of different ways to engage with information. So there's audio and visual opportunities throughout. So that also is another layer to think about within your discipline related to what your students are able to do with that content that you're teaching. So along this concept of this idea of interpreting and creating text, let's really be clear that we understand how we define text in 2017. So let's put our Mythbuster hats on again, and let's decide if this statement is a myth or if this is confirmed. And Andrea so kindly put our poll up here. So the statement is text can include printed words on paper and digital, as well as media such as images and video. So do you find that to be a myth or confirmed? Oh,
our audience feels strongly, 100% say confirmed.
They absolutely do. So that's a really important piece, because then you're absolutely right. It is confirmed, and in many instances, it's actually even part of our state standards. So here are two examples of standards that include media sources in addition to text. So as you're thinking about that way for students to interpret and create, and along with the idea of what text is, a lot of times we default, and I won't tell you how old I am, but I've been around for a while, and as a student myself and as an educator, and I think, a lot of times we kind of default back to print. We go back to textbooks, we go back to photocopies and printed things, and actually even the PowerPoint that you're looking at right now, is really a lot about text. So we know that school is text heavy, and we certainly know that that's an important thing for our students to be able to walk away with to help them be prepared for that unpredictable future that we talked about in the beginning. But please keep in mind, and please don't discount the importance of other media in your discipline. So whether that be, like I said earlier, sounds and images and video and other ways for students to interact. And you'll notice here these two standards obviously come from college and career readiness standards across different states. So regardless of whether your state has formulated this in this exact language or not, there's most likely something very similar in your state standards that addresses this idea of diverse formats and media within each discipline. So we've talked a little bit about disciplinary literacy, what it is and isn't. We've talked a little bit about why it matters for our students, and particularly in ways that really equip them to be prepared for their future. So let's spend a few minutes now talking about how to maximize it for our students. So one particular way, and is a nice little acronym here. Well, it's not really an acronym. It's just a little mnemonic to help you kind of remember this. And as you might have seen earlier, I was a reading specialist, so like I said, literacy is near and dear to my heart. I'm a big fan of the alphabet. So I'm not going to give you ABCs, but I am going to give you AEIOU. And here's an AEIOU that you can take away as a reminder of how to maximize disciplinary literacy in your classroom. And it's really, in order to acquire discipline-specific skills and enrich learning, we need to integrate the standards, offer a variety of text, including media, that are unique to the discipline. So that's your AEIOU for the day, and you can think about how that applies to the specific discipline or disciplines that you teach, regardless of the grade level and the subject area. So let's look at an example of how that might look and how we can take the specific disciplinary literacy skills and match them to a diverse media type. And the example that we're going to look at right now is actually a social studies example. So this is a screenshot from our social studies textbook. Discovery Education Social Studies textbook provides a variety of integrated media, interactive text, primary sources, videos and images. So the goal of this middle school social studies resource, and this one in particular is a history example, but is also available in history, geography, civics. These resources are for students to explore, the goals really are for students to explore key issues, develop core concepts, and acquire that knowledge that's specific to the discipline of social studies. So for example, what does it mean to read, write, and think like a historian? Or what does it mean to read, write, and think like a geographer? So we provide students with this multimedia resources, including primary sources in social studies textbook, to develop those critical thinking skills, such as compare, analyze, interpret, because they're all heavily dependent on a variety of those literacy skills and thinking processes that students will need. And the same is true in the Discovery Education K-12 science textbooks and math textbooks for grades 6 through 12, as well as Streaming Plus, which provides a rich and robust collection of diverse media formats for all subjects, K through 12. So regardless of the subject or the grade level, there's a robust collection of media, including sounds and sound bites and songs and reading passages and videos and video clips and interactive opportunities for students to interact with whatever the content is that is in their discipline. So that's our 3 keys of disciplinary literacy and why they matter, why it matters, and how to maximize it for your students. with some strategies and with some ideas to align your work with this idea of disciplinary literacy and how to best maximize it for your students. So, Andrea, now might be a good time for any questions and answers, or question and answer time, whether it be related to the handout or the presentation or the topic.
Sure. We have a few questions in, and everyone can feel free to continue to post as we're going through these. Can you expand or explain on how the concept of disciplinary literacy can support or fit in with STEM initiatives?
Oh, absolutely. So disciplinary literacy, and if you're familiar with the concept of STEM, obviously STEM kind of transcends the disciplines. So we think of transdisciplinary learning in STEM because we've taken those disciplines of science, technology, engineering, and math, and certainly in many instances we've included the arts and language arts and communication. So that is almost like a cross-pollination of those skills. So we're now marrying and connecting all of those literacy skills and connecting them into, usually through an inquiry-based topic. So perhaps the topic might be, renewable resources and sustaining a healthy planet. So that topic is married throughout all of those disciplines so that all of those specific math critical thinking skills and science literacy skills and social literacy skills are now being practiced in tandem with each other. So it's not as isolated as it may have been in a traditional model where we go to science class for 40 minutes and we hone in on the science topic through these disciplinary literacy skills, and then we move on to another subject area in 45 minutes and we go through our chunks of the day. It's much more integrated, which truly, and Andrea and you all in the audience know that that's really how life is. Life isn't broken into subject areas. Life is very interconnected. So I don't know about you, but I don't do my checkbook for my math for a period of time during the day and then not do math for the rest of the day because I'm doing other subjects. So it's really a real world application with STEM, and it's really about, in fact, here at Discovery Education, we use the acronym for STEM to be students and teachers energizing minds instead of science, technology, engineering, and math. So it's really about energizing the student mind and really getting those thought processes all interconnected into a real-world application.
Great, thanks for that. And can you talk a little bit more about the nuances of understanding versus interpreting and consuming texts?
Sure, absolutely. So when we think about the idea of understanding, it's really that deep knowledge, and well, even goes beyond knowledge. Like I can know the capitals of the United States. I can know what they are, but really when you think about understanding, it's really much more about understanding, for example, why we even have state capitals. Why are they located where they are? What was the thinking that went into that? What is the benefit of that? What are the disadvantages of that? So it's really being much more analytical as we're really digging into the idea of understanding rather than just knowing. And just having that knowledge isn't necessarily going to transfer into real world or really going to help us really make deeper decisions. I often use the example, and this might be a little interesting now, especially now that we've done a little myth busting, is that we can think of our students and our classrooms as one of two things. We can think of them as Jeopardy, like are we playing Jeopardy and are we equipping our students with knowledge so that they can go win on Jeopardy, or are we equipping our students with information and understanding so they can think like Mythbusters, so that they can try to uncover and experiment. And I don't know if any of you have watched the show Mythbusters, and actually it's no longer on the air, so if you do, you need to go back and find an archive episode, but it's really about curiosity and wonder and trial and error and perseverance and really developing some of those true inquiry learning-based opportunities to really make sense of things that are transferable, that have application to real life and are meaningful.
Great, and can you give us some of your thoughts on some initial steps we can do to engage students to move from consuming content to creating content?
Absolutely. So when you think of the ways in which your students are interacting with the content, so the consuming idea, certainly it's important for our students to gather information, whether that be through research or through the information that you're presenting with them to them, but also opportunities for them to create. And actually, Discovery Education, if you have access to that, you have access to our Board Builder tool, which is a wonderful tool for creating multimedia projects. Certainly there are other ways to do that as well, but having students create, one example that I know of in a low-tech environment is even just having students write on cards the information that they know or that they're learning in a presentation in which something that they might create a website or they might create a presentation, and then their job is to hyperlink and which words would be hyperlinked in this, and then where would that take us to. So what might I click, what's important in your presentation, what words on the screen are important, and which words would you hyperlink, and then what information would that take you to. So really helping students to think about an audience, thinking about creating information that they could share with a real audience, whether it be audience of their peers or audience beyond the classroom. And one of the wonderful benefits of technology, certainly, is that it gives us the access to connect with the world. So rather than just necessarily writing a paper, I mean, when I was in school, again, we won't go back into how long ago that was, but when I was in school, if I wrote a paper or I wrote an essay or I did a research project, it was really for one person. It was really for my teacher. That was the only audience member. And I think when we think about opportunities for creation and ways to equip our students for their future and even for today, it's really about creating for an authentic audience rather than just writing a paper for the teacher, but perhaps writing an essay or a letter or a research paper that will inform a group or an audience that may or may not be even in my classroom. They might be beyond my classroom. They might be in my community. They might be beyond my community. They might be in another country or on the other side of the globe. So ways to make some of those connections for students to communicate, not just by consuming information, but by creating it for an authentic audience.
Great. Those are all the questions that have come in at this time. Did you have any additional words for our audience?
I do not. I think thank you all for attending, and I hope that this was helpful to you. I hope that the handout is a great resource for you to really think about opportunities to really raise the rigor and support your students in critical thinking as they interpret and create text. And now that you think about text, you'll know that you'll think about it beyond just printed word on paper, and certainly include the idea of diverse media in that as well. And certainly my email is up on the screen, so feel free. I know Andrea will be sharing all the resources with you, so you'll have this as well.
That's right, and we just had another question pop up about if there's a way to promote this or to share it for professional development, and the answer is yes. You will be receiving a copy of this presentation along with the recording, which you can feel free to share with anyone that you'd like. Before we conclude, I want to invite everyone to visit our website at ncea.org/webinars to see listings for upcoming webinars and our other professional development events, including our NCEA Convention and Expo in St. Louis, where Johnna will be one of our speakers. So if you want to hear more from her, that will be one opportunity to do so. We also have additional webinar offerings coming up from Discovery Education in this academic year, so please join us for those. And thank you all for spending your time with us today and for the active participation, and to Frank and Johnna for their expertise and their time. So as a reminder, you will be getting all these materials within 24 hours via email, and I want to thank you all again, and I hope you enjoy a blessed evening. Good night.